Let me tell you about a girl named Ciara. She was the pride of her family, the kind of girl that everyone in the village noticed, admired, and whispered about, though only good things, of course. With skin the color of rich caramel, eyes that sparkled with dreams, and a mind sharp enough to leave her teachers in awe, she was destined for something remarkable. The kind of kid everyone thought would grow up to be famous or powerful, or at the very least, to lead the village for bigger things. From the time she was small, she had ambition woven into her bones, dreaming of the sky, of clouds, of flying beyond the limits of anyone's imagination. Her dream was to one day become a pilot, soaring across the world and seeing places most could only imagine. This is the story of how a heart, once filled with dreams of flying, of adventure, of love, was dragged down, broken, twisted, and transformed. It's a story about the line between love and hate, about how sometimes the most beautiful things can turn dangerous when pushed too far. Because a heart betrayed doesn't just disappear, it waits, it remembers, and sometimes it strikes back with a force no one sees coming. So listen carefully, because what happened next is not something they'll ever teach you in school. This is not a tale with a happy ending. It's a tale of love that went wrong, of dreams turned sour, of a quiet girl who could no longer hold back the storm raging within her. Ciara's story started long before anyone knew what lay ahead. She was the sort of child people admired from afar and doted on up close. Growing up in a warm family, she was the only daughter, with parents who adored her and poured all they had into nurturing her bright mind and kind heart. To everyone in the village, she was a shining star, a girl whose future seemed as endless as the African sky. With her caramel skin, deep brown eyes, and that sweet, confident smile, Ciara was easy to love. She had that rare mix of beauty and brains, a young girl who showed promise in everything she did. From a young age, Ciara had one dream, one single ambition that seemed to lift her above the ordinary. She wanted to fly, not just metaphorically, but truly. She dreamed of becoming a pilot, a profession that, for most in her village, was as far-fetched as touching the moon. But her parents, humble as they were, never discouraged her. They took pride in her dreams, telling everyone who would listen about how their Ciara would one day soar above the clouds, visiting distant lands they'd only heard about. And Ciara worked hard, studying every night by candlelight, pushing herself to excel in school. She wasn't just any student, she was the best year after year. Her teachers marveled at her dedication and her peers looked up to her. And then there was Richie. Richie had been her best friend since they could both walk. Two children running through the dusty streets, laughing, exploring, sharing secrets. He was her confidant, her the half, and as they grew older, that friendship turned into something deeper. He was there with her every step of the way, cheering her on, sharing in her successes. Where she was quiet, he was bold, always making her laugh, always encouraging her dreams. They were the type of friends that everyone knew would someday fall in love, though no one dared say it aloud. They became a secret couple, young and full of promises whispered under starlit skies. Richie's family didn't have much, but he never let that hold him back. He'd save up his allowance just to buy her small gifts, bracelets, books, anything that made her smile. And even though Ciara was fiercely dedicated to her studies, she made room in her life for Richie. She believed in him, saw in him the same potential she saw in herself. And when he was down, she lifted him, even when it meant putting herself at risk. But in their world, family honor and loyalty ran deep. It was expected that a girl like Ciara would uphold her family's pride and bring honor to their name. Her parents had given her everything they could, support, love, and unwavering belief. She couldn't let them down. And so while Ciara's heart was tangled up with Richie, she knew there were boundaries she dared not cross. They kept their love quiet, their bond unspoken to the rest of the world. For Ciara, loyalty to her family and to Richie were intertwined to two parts of the same whole. Yet life has a way of testing the things we hold dear, forcing us to make choices we never imagined. For Ciara, her love for Richie was not just a feeling, it was a loyalty that went deeper than words. But in a world where dreams and reality often collide, not even Ciara could foresee how quickly everything she loved would slip from her grasp. As the years passed, Ciara and Richie's bond grew stronger, shifting from the simplicity of childhood friendship to something deeper, something they didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. They spent countless hours together, often hidden away from curious eyes. There was a small grove by the river, a place where the trees bent together like an umbrella shielding them from the world. Here, Ciara and Richie would steal quiet moments, whispering their dreams, holding hands, exchanging glances that spoke of promises they were too young to make. Their love was like the dry season rain, rare, quiet, yet nourishing in a way neither of them could quite explain. They'd walk along the narrow, winding paths, laughing and talking, each lost in the other. For Richie, Ciara was the anchor in his life. Where his family struggled just to put food on the table, she had the stability and support he craved. Her dreams inspired him, her drive made him believe that maybe, just maybe, he could reach for more too. Yet Ciara, even as she gave her heart to Richie, never lost sight of her dreams. She would stay up late at night studying by the glow of a kerosene lamp, memorizing facts, solving problems, pushing herself. She was determined not to let her love for Richie distract her from her path, determined to rise above for herself and for her family. In those stone moments of laughter and love, Ciara still kept one foot in the world of her ambitions, juggling her love for Richie with her unbreakable resolve to succeed. Richie, however, had a different struggle. His family was poor. They had barely enough to survive. While Ciara's family managed to scrape together the little she needed for her education, Richie's family was often forced to make hard choices. He was bright and capable, but in their village, talent and ambition didn't always feed an empty stomach. Still, he never wanted to burden Ciara. To him, she was a beacon of light, and he didn't want to drag her into the shadows of his own worries. But love has a way of weaving itself into every part of your life, making secrets harder to keep. One evening, Richie confided in Ciara. They were both preparing for their WAEC exams, the most important milestone in their young lives, the exams that would determine whether they could move forward with their dreams. But Richie, for all his determination, had lost the money for his registration fee. It was a small sum, but for his family it might as well have been a fortune. He was crushed, and in a quiet voice, he told Ciara that he might not be able to take the exams with her. The thought of Richie being left behind, of him watching her leave without him, was unbearable for Ciara. She couldn't imagine her life without him by her side, and so without a second thought, she did something she'd never done before. She waited until her parents were asleep and snuck into her father's room, carefully slipping a few bills from his hidden stash. Her heart pounded as she crept back to her room, guilt gnawing at her, but love pushed her forward. The next day, she handed the money to Richie with a smile, dismissing his protests, telling him it was nothing, that she'd simply saved her pocket money. But secrets have a way of surfacing. Ciara's father discovered the missing money within days, and her mother's suspicion quickly fell on her. Ciara had never lied to them before, but now she found herself caught, unable to explain. Her parents were furious, unable to understand why their obedient, beloved daughter would suddenly act so out of character. They demanded an explanation, but Ciara held her silence, protecting Richie, even as her father's angry words stung and her mother's disappointment pierced her heart. The punishment was swift and harsh, and yet Ciara never spoke a word of Richie's role. She took every consequence in silence, all for him, all for love. But it didn't end there. As Richie's family struggled with food shortage, Ciara continued to steal food from her own kitchen, slipping him packages of bread, dried fish, and sometimes rice. She would slip the food into her bag after dinner, sneaking it out under cover of darkness. Richie would meet her at the edge of the village, his gratitude filling the quiet night air as he held her hand and promised her that one day he'd make it all up to her. Each time Ciara returned home to face another confrontation with her parents, her small defiance slowly chipping away at the trust she had always enjoyed. And each time she stayed silent, willing to bear the punishment in exchange for Richie's happiness. She told herself it was only for now, only until the exams, only until they could both leave for bigger, brighter futures. In the quiet corners of her heart, Ciara knew she was risking everything, her family's trust, her own future for Richie. But she also believed, as only the young can, that love would make everything worth it in the end. She believed that Richie would someday look back and remember the sacrifices she'd made, that he would cherish her as deeply as she cherished him. But fate, as Ciara was beginning to learn, rarely rewards the purest intentions. For every secret she kept, every sacrifice she made, there was an unseen cost, and in the world beyond her dreams and hidden moments, the seeds of her future heartbreak were already taking root. It happened gradually, with only a whisper of warning, like dark clouds gathering on the horizon long before a storm. One day, Ciara began to feel unwell first, a slight wave of nausea here and there, then a strange fatigue that tugged at every step. She brushed it off as exhaustion from the late nights of studying, from the relentless pressure she felt to excel, to make her family proud, to build a future where Richie could stand beside her. But soon these symptoms grew into an unsettling realization that gnawed at her, unacknowledged but ever present. She began counting days, watching the moon pass through its phases, and when the truth finally settled in her heart, it left her breathless with terror. She was pregnant. At first she could hardly believe it. How could this happen to her? The girl who had always done what was expected, who had only ever made one secret exception to the rules. She was gripped by an overwhelming panic, her mind racing through every possible consequence. Her dreams, her family's pride, her place in the village, all of it hung by a thread. She felt as if the ground beneath her had given way, leaving her suspended over a vast dark chasm. She tried to stay calm, to think logically, but the fear clawed at her, unrelenting. After several sleepless nights, Ciara finally confided in Richie, the only person she felt she could turn to. She had rehearsed what she would say a dozen times, but as soon as she saw his face, the words slipped out in a terrified rush. Richie stood frozen, the shock in his eyes mirroring her own. For a moment he said nothing, and Ciara's heart sank, thinking he might turn white then and there. But he quickly recovered, putting an arm around her and whispering reassurances she desperately needed to hear, his voice steady even though his own future had been upended in that single moment. But as days passed, Richie's reassurances turned into something darker. He became quiet and restless, his mind spinning with ideas of how to handle the situation, as he began to call it. Soon he suggested they needed a solution, one that would allow them both to walk away free and unharmed. At first, Ciara couldn't believe what he was implying. An abortion was not something she could even fathom. It went against everything she had ever believed in, everything her family had taught her. But Richie, in his own quiet and persuasive way, began to wear her down. He argued that they were too young, that having a child now would ruin everything, not only for him but for her too. He painted pictures of a life where they'd be forced to abandon their dreams, trapped by responsibilities they weren't ready for. And so after weeks of relentless pressure, after nights spent battling her own conscience, Ciara finally agreed. She loved Richie with a fierceness that made her willing to set aside her own fears, her own beliefs, all for his sake. She told herself it was for the best, that it was the only way they could still hold on to their dreams. But beneath her reluctant acceptance, there was a dread that she couldn't shake, a dark feeling that this choice would cost her more than she could imagine. In their small village, there were few options for such a secret. Richie found a local doctor, a man known for his discretion but not necessarily his skill. He had no clinic, just a small back room that smelled of herbs and something sharper, a place Ciara wouldn't have stepped into under any other circumstance. But here she was, lying on a rough cot, the world spinning as the procedure began. She had been nervous before, but nothing could have prepared her for the excruciating pain that felt like her body and soul were being torn apart. She gripped the sides of the cot, biting her lips so hard it bled, holding back screams as wave after wave of agony coursed through her. She thought she would die right there, her dreams and hopes and fears swallowed up in that dim, shadowed room. When it was over, she could barely stand. Her body felt broken, as if it had lost something it could never regain. She stumbled home alone, clutching her stomach, her heart a raw wound. Richie had promised to wait for her, but when she emerged, he was nowhere to be found. She limped back to her house, her parents unaware of the secret she now carried like a stone inside her. Days later, the bleeding began. It was relentless, a constant reminder of what she had done, what she had sacrificed. When she finally gathered the courage to return to the doctor, he delivered the news in a cold, clinical voice. Her womb was damaged beyond repair. The possibility of bearing children was gone. The shock hit her like a tidal wave. She stumbled out of his home, lost in a fog of disbelief, her world shattered beyond recognition. And yet, despite everything, she kept her pain hidden. She buried the trauma deep inside, returning to her studies with a new intensity, a fierceness born of desperation. Her parents never suspected a thing. She was still their perfect daughter, still the brilliant student they believed would one day achieve greatness. Only Richie knew, and he continued to reassure her, to tell her that they were still in this together, that he loved her, that none of this changed anything. But as the weeks turned to months, Ciara noticed something else, something that gnawed at her even more than her own pain. Richie had grown distant, his warm reassurances cooling to brief hollow words. He was often too busy to meet, his gaze shifting away when she tried to catch his eye, his voice just a little too quick to dismiss her questions. She told herself it was stress, that he was just focused on their upcoming exams, that she was imagining things. But in the quiet moments, alone with her thoughts, she began to wonder if he was slipping away, if the promises he'd made to her, if those dim, desperate hours had all been nothing more than empty words. And so Ciara continued to hide her pain, carrying on as if nothing had changed. She poured her energy into her studies, clutching at the last pieces of her old life, the life she sacrificed everything for. But beneath the surface, the weight of her secret grew heavier with each passing day, pulling her deeper and deeper into a darkness she could neither escape nor share. Little did she know, this was only the beginning. The day the wake results came out, the village buzzed with excitement. Parents gathered around the school notice board, anxious to see the future spelled out in rows of names and scores. And there, at the very top, was Ciara's name shining like a beacon. She had done it. She was the best, the highest score, the pride of her family, of the entire village. Her parents, brimming with joy, showered her with praise and blessings, the hope for her future dancing in their eyes. They knew she was destined for great things, that she would be the one to lift the family's name to heights it had never seen. And Richie was there too, beaming with pride. He had done well, scoring high enough to secure a place at the university in the city. For that brief moment, everything seemed to be as they had dreamed, with their futures bright and waiting for them. Ciara had never been happier. She and Richie were on the brink of a new life, one they had dreamed of together since they were children. The years of sacrifice, the secret heartbreaks, the whispered promises, all of it was about to come to fruition. She imagined them studying side by side in the city, holding hands in the bustling university corridors, their future as solid as the bond they shared. But reality has a cruel way of twisting dreams into something unrecognizable. Just months before they were both set to leave for their respective universities, Richie called her to the grove by the river, the place where they had shared so many secrets, so many tender moments. But his face, usually filled with warmth and affection, was unreadable cold even. As Ciara approached him, her heart filled with excitement for the journey they were about to embark on, she had no idea that the life she had so carefully built around him was about to shatter. In a calm, measured voice, Richie told her that he was leaving her. He spoke of new beginnings, of opportunities, of needing to focus on himself. His words were sharp, like stones dropped one by one into the river of her heart, causing ripples of shock and disbelief. She could hardly understand what he was saying. This was Richie, her Richie, the one who had made her promises under the stars, who had held her when she was broken, who had whispered words of love even as she sacrificed everything for him. And now here he was, turning his back on her as if she were nothing more than a memory he was ready to leave behind. Ciara felt as if her entire world had come undone. She pleaded with him, reminding him of everything they had shared, everything she had done for him, sacrifices she had made. She whispered words of love and loyalty, hoping to see some flicker of warmth in his eyes, some hint that he still cared. But Richie's gaze remained steady, indifferent. He told her it was time to move on, that they were young, that she would understand one day. The words stung more than any blow, each syllable stripping away the dreams she had built, leaving nothing but the harsh reality that he no longer wanted her. Ciara stumbled back home, her mind spinning, her heart broken beyond repair. The pain was unlike anything she had ever felt. She had endured the beatings, the lies, the sacrifices, all for him. She had lost her innocence, her trust, and in the end, her own future. She had stood by him through every hardship, every challenge, and now when the future they had dreamed of was within reach, he discarded her as if she were nothing. That night she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the tears slipping down her face like silent witnesses to her devastation. But the torment did not end there. As the days passed, Richie did not leave for the city right away. Instead, he remained in the village, and it wasn't long before Ciara heard the rumors. Richie had been seen with another girl, a lively, beautiful girl named Tolani, who had always been a favorite in the village. She was playful, carefree, and had a smile that drew people in. It wasn't long before Richie and Tolani were inseparable, their laughter ringing through the village, their whispers and stolen glances echoing what Ciara had once shared with him. Each time Ciara saw them together, it felt like a fresh wound, raw and deep. The sight of Richie holding Tolani's hand, of him gazing at her with the same tenderness he had once reserved for Ciara, was unbearable. It was as if he was flaunting their relationship, as if he wanted her to see just how easily he had replaced her. Her heartbreak transformed into a hollow ache, one that pulsed with every beat of her heart, with every reminder that the love she had believed in was nothing more than an illusion. The village, oblivious to the secrets hidden beneath Ciara's calm exterior, buzzed with gossip and whispers. They commented on how quickly Richie had moved on, how Tolani had won his heart. But no one knew of the sacrifices Ciara had made, of the painful choices she had been forced to endure. No one saw the silent suffering etched into her every glance, every forced smile. Days turned into weeks, and Ciara's heartbreak grew darker, deeper. The dreams she had once cherished became shadows, haunting her every step. She felt like a ghost wandering through the village, unseen, unheard, her world reduced to nothing more than memories and shattered promises. She tried to focus on her future, on the journey to the university, but even her dreams of flying, of escaping, seemed tainted by Richie's betrayal. And as she watched Richie and Tolani, as she saw the life that should have been hers playing out before her eyes, something inside Ciara began to shift. The pain, the heartbreak, the betrayal, they no longer felt like wounds, but like embers smoldering in the depths of her heart. A rage began to build, slow and steady, filling the emptiness left by Richie's rejection. She was done with tears, done with sorrow. If love had brought her to her knees, then perhaps it was time to let something else lift her back up. Ciara smiled to herself, a cold, bitter smile, one that held none of the warmth that had once defined her. She knew what she had to do. The girl who had once dreamed of flying, of touching the sky, was gone. In her place was someone new, someone forged by heartbreak and betrayal, someone who was ready to face the pain and make sure that Richie understood the weight of what he had done. For in her heart, Ciara knew this. A heart betrayed does not simply forget. And if Richie had thought he could break her and walk away, he was about to learn just how wrong he had been. Heartbreak may crack a soul, but betrayal forges it anew, harder, sharper, and more dangerous. Ciara's transformation did not happen overnight. She was deliberate, careful, like an artist painting in subtle strokes. This was not the impulse of a girl scorned, it was the resolve of a woman seeking justice in her own way. If she once had dreams of flight, those had been replaced by a different sort of vision, one rooted in the earth, in the raw desire to make Richie feel every ounce of the pain he had inflicted upon her. She knew she needed patience. Her rage had to be tempered, her movements subtle. And so, with the same precision she had once used in her studies, Ciara began crafting a new role for herself, the role of the forgiving friend. It started with small gestures. She made a point to pass by Richie's house, greeting him and Tolani warmly, her face a flawless mask of kindness. She would wave with a soft smile, even bringing small gifts. A bowl of rice, a bunch of ripe plantains, under the pretense of neighborly goodwill. In the village, gestures of kindness were cherished, and her actions raised no suspicion. People murmured about how gracious Ciara was, how well she had handled herself after Richie's betrayal. She had earned their admiration, their respect, but none of them knew of the storm brewing beneath her placid exterior. Richie, oblivious as ever, was relieved by her apparent forgiveness. Perhaps in his arrogance he had always assumed that Ciara would eventually come around and let bygones be bygones. Tolani, sweet and trusting, welcomed Ciara with open arms, charmed by her intelligence and grace. In her eyes, Ciara was not a threat, but rather a newfound friend, someone she could confide in about her relationship with Richie, someone who would offer advice with a knowing smile and understanding nod. Ciara made herself indispensable to them. She would listen to Tolani's stories, laugh at Richie's jokes, join them for walks around the village. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made was calculated, designed to make them believe that she had truly let go of the past. It wasn't long before she became a fixture in their lives, her presence as familiar and welcome as the evening breeze. As time passed, Ciara's act grew more elaborate. She offered to help Tolani with her studies, her academic prowess, a valuable asset for someone preparing for university. Tolani, thrilled by the attention and guidance, often invited Ciara over to study sessions, where the two would spend hours bent over textbooks. And each time Tolani thanked her, Ciara would respond with a smile that hid the dark satisfaction simmering within her. This was no longer just an act of friendship. It was a strategy, a way of embedding herself deeper into their lives, of making herself irreplaceable. But it wasn't enough to gain their trust. Ciara needed to know them, truly know them, in a way that only time and observation could reveal. She watched them closely, noting every detail, every habit, every flaw. She studied the way Tolani held her spoon, how Richie's voice softened when he spoke to her, the small quarrels they would have over trivial matters. She noted the times they met, the places they frequented, the conversations they had when they felt no one was listening. Each observation was stored away, like pieces of a puzzle that would one day come together in a perfect picture of her revenge. At times she would join them for meals, her heart steady, her mind focused as she sat across from Richie, sharing food and laughter as if the past had never happened. And each time she would tell herself, "Patience, Ciara, patience." The old proverb echoed in her mind. When a snake decides to strike, it does not rush but waits for the perfect moment. She knew she had to wait, to let the tension build until she could strike with precision, with finality. It was during one of these meals that Ciara first felt the weight of her plan settle over her fully. She had brought over a simple stew, sharing it with Richie and Tolani in the dim glow of evening. Tolani had praised her cooking, laughing and asking Ciara for tips on preparing the dish. As she watched them eat, Ciara's mind drifted to the future, to the moment she would finally see the consequences of their betrayal unfold. But she kept her face serene, her laughter genuine, her words light. She was a master of her own emotions now, each feeling under tight control, her heart as cold and hard as steel. The villagers, meanwhile, were none the wiser. They continued to praise Ciara's maturity, her kindness, marveling at how well she had handled herself. It was as though they had forgotten the hurt Richie had caused her, as if his betrayal was a thing of the past, a mere hiccup in the otherwise smooth rhythm of village life. Only Ciara knew the truth that pain, when buried, grows roots, twisting and coiling until it becomes part of you, a dark force that fuels every breath, every heartbeat. And as she waited, Ciara began to feel a strange sense of satisfaction. For the first time in her life, she was in control, not just of herself, but of the very people who had wronged her. She held their lives in the palm of her hand, her revenge unfolding in slow, deliberate steps. Each act of kindness, each gesture of friendship was another thread woven into the web she was spinning, a web that would trap Richie and Tolani before they even realized it had been set. There were moments, of course, when Ciara's mask would slip, when her heart would throb with the weight of what she was doing. In the quiet of the night, when the village was silent and the stars hung heavy above, she would think of the girl she had once been, the girl with dreams of flying, of seeing the world. She would remember the love she had felt for Richie, the faith she had in their future, and a part of her would ache with a sadness so profound it felt like a wound. But she would push these feelings away, hardening herself, reminding herself that she could not afford weakness. Not now, not when she was so close. And so Ciara continued her charade, her every action cloaked in kindness, her every word laced with subtle manipulation. She was a daughter of the village, a girl who knew how to wield the traditions, the proverbs, the expectations of her culture to her advantage. She would often recall the wise words of her elders, the stories they told of hidden intentions and masked betrayals, each one a reminder that even the most beautiful of faces could hide the darkest of hearts. As the days slipped by, Ciara's plan took shape, each piece falling into place with quiet precision. She was no longer simply a girl betrayed, she was a force of nature, a stone waiting to break, a snake poised to strike. And with every passing moment, she knew she was drawing closer to the point of no return, to the day when Richie and Tolani would finally face the consequences of their actions. The village watched, unaware, as Ciara wove her web around the two lovers, her face as serene as the moon, her heart as dark as the night that concealed her true intentions. For her, there was no turning back. She had chosen her path, and she would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. For when a heart betrayed takes up the mantle of revenge, it does not rest until justice is done. Ciara had spent weeks preparing, refining every detail, every gesture, every word, building towards this moment with the meticulous care of an artist putting final touches on a masterpiece. She knew she had to create the perfect illusion of peace, of reconciliation so complete that even Richie, for all his arrogance, would believe she had truly moved on. The time had come for the final act in her carefully constructed plan. One warm evening, just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting golden light across the village, Ciara decided to set her plan into motion. She approached Richie, her face serene, her voice light, and told him she had a surprise. She would be cooking his favorite meal, igizi soup with pounded yam, just the way he had always liked it, the way she used to prepare it when they were together. It was an invitation laced with nostalgia and care, a gesture that seemed genuine, meant to stir memories of their shared past. Richie, unsuspecting, smiled warmly, his eyes lighting up at the thought of enjoying a meal prepared by her hand once again. The seed had been planted. The next day, Ciara spent hours preparing the meal. She gathered the finest ingredients, fresh palm oil, ground melon seeds for the igizi, and tender pieces of meat, the very best she could find. She moved through her kitchen with a calm focus, each step deliberate, each movement precise. The aroma of spices filled the air, and as she stirred the pot, she infused it with the intensity of her emotions, her silent rage mixed with the sweetness of feigned affection. Her hands never faltered, her face never betrayed a hint of the storm within her. This meal, crafted with love and care, was meant for a purpose no one could see. As the final touch, she took a small pouch of powder, hidden carefully away for this moment. This was the substance she had procured from the village herbalist, a powder known for its potency, its ability to end lives quietly, without a trace. She added it to the stew, just enough to ensure that those who ate would slip into an eternal sleep. Her hands steady, she stirred it in, watching as it disappeared into the rich, thick sauce of the igizi, blending perfectly, invisibly. When the meal was ready, she packaged it carefully, wrapping it in a bright cloth to keep it warm, her movements calm and collected, as if this were any other meal, prepared with nothing but love. She carried it to Richie's house, her footsteps slow and deliberate, her heart steady. When she arrived, she greeted him with a smile that spoke of peace, a smile that conveyed nothing but kindness. Richie, delighted, took the bundle from her, thanking her warmly, his gratitude as real as his ignorance of what lay within. "Enjoy it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes holding his for just a moment longer than necessary. She watched him, her gaze steady, as he smiled, lifting the bundle high in his hands, a look of genuine appreciation on his face. And then he turned, stepping back into his house, unaware that he was carrying his own fate in his hands. Ciara lingered outside for a moment, listening to the sounds of the village, watching the glow of the setting sun casting long shadows over the earth. She could almost feel the weight of what she had done settling over her, a quiet finality that wrapped around her like the night. But her face remained calm, her heart steady. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. Inside Rishi's home, The meal was received with joy and laughter. His family gathered around the table, the aroma of the EDC soup filling the air. It scent rich and inviting. Richie's mother served generous portions to everyone, piling the pounded yam high on their plates, the warmth of family and love filling the room. Richie, seated beside Tolani, glanced over at her with a proud smile, knowing that the meal had been a gift from his friend Ciara. His family praised her kindness, remarking on her maturity, her generosity, unaware of the true nature of her gift. They ate with relish, savoring each bite, the taste rich and familiar, a reminder of home and comfort. Richie himself took large spoonfuls, laughing with his younger siblings, making jokes about Ciara's cooking, praising her ability to make the best egusi in the village. Tolani, smiling, took his hand under the table, a look of contentment on her face. It was a scene of warmth, of unity, a scene that seemed untouched by the shadows lurking just beyond the walls. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, a change began to creep into the room. Richie's father, usually talkative and animated, fell silent, his laughter fading into a frown as his face grew pale. His mother, still holding her spoon, suddenly swayed in her seat, a look of confusion flickering across her eyes. Richie, noticing his parents' unease, was about to speak when a wave of dizziness washed over him, his vision blurring, the edges of the room growing hazy. One by one, each member of the family began to feel a heaviness, a numbness that spread through their limbs, leaving them weak and disoriented. The laughter faded, replaced by murmurs of confusion, by fearful glances exchanged across the table. Tolani gripped Richie's hand tighter, her face pale, her breathing shallow, as if her very life was slipping away with each breath. Richie tried to stand to call for help, but his legs buckled beneath him, his strength draining away like water through a sieve. He looked around, his gaze falling on his family, his heart pounding with a dread he couldn't understand. His mother's head drooped, her spoon slipping from her hand, landing with a soft clink on the plate below. His younger siblings, their faces ashen, leaned against each other, their small frames trembling as the poison took its toll. Silence fell over the room, thick and suffocating. The laughter, the warmth, the sense of family, all of it was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness, a quiet that held the weight of death. Richie, his vision dimming, managed one last glance at Tolani, her face pale and motionless, her hand still entwined with his, her life slipping away with him. As the last breath left his body, a final thought flit through his mind, a fleeting memory of Ciara, her soft smile, her warm eyes, the girl he had once loved, the girl he had betrayed. And with that thought, the darkness claimed him. Outside, Ciara stood beneath the darkening sky, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her expression unreadable. She knew what was happening behind those walls, knew that the gift she had left behind had finally completed its purpose. But there was no satisfaction, no sense of triumph, just a quiet, empty calm like the stillness after a storm. The village would wake to tragedy, to loss, and she would play her role, her mask flawless as ever. For now, though, she remained in the fading light, a lone figure against the backdrop of a village that would never know the true story behind the meal that had brought death into Richie's home. As she turned to leave, a single thought echoed in her mind, a thought that seemed to drift through the silence like a whisper. Betrayal has a price, and today that price has been paid in full. The dawn that rose over the village was heavy, casting long shadows as the villagers gathered in somber silence around Richie's home. It was early, too early for news like this, yet everyone in the village knew something terrible had happened. It had started with a neighbor knocking on Richie's door to share a morning greeting, only to find the entire family slumped around the dining table, the remnants of their last meal before them. She stumbled back, her cries splitting the morning air, drawing people from their homes, each face growing paler, each gasp louder as the realization spread. Richie, his parents, his younger siblings, and even Tolani, gone, taken in a single night by an invisible hand. As the villagers gathered, murmurs of disbelief mixed with the rising sound of wails and whispered prayers. It felt as if a shadow had fallen over the village, pulling them into the depths of an incomprehensible tragedy. Mothers clutched their children close, men stood with furrowed brows, and elderly villagers shook their heads, fear etched deeply into their expressions. How could this happen? How could an entire family be taken so quickly, so quietly? In the confusion, the villagers speculated. Some whispered that a curse had struck, an evil spirit unleashed upon the family. Others, more practical, suspected an illness. But as the day wore on, whispers of something darker began to spread, a rumor of poison, of vengeance, of a hand that had set this dark event into motion. The murmurs grew louder, fingers pointed, and suspicion swirled until the community was gripped by a mixture of sorrow and dread. And then the truth began to emerge. An elder, a long-time herbalist in the village, had been approached by a young woman days earlier, a girl he knew well, one he had watched grow up in the village. She had asked for a specific powder, her face calm, her words rehearsed. She had explained that she needed it for pests in her family's home, nothing more. It was a common enough request, and he had provided it without question. But in the face of this tragedy, he felt a creeping suspicion settle over him, one he couldn't ignore. The woman had been Ciara. Heart-pounding, the herbalist took his discovery to the village elder, sharing his suspicions with a heavy heart. He described Ciara's visit, her calm demeanor, her insistence. As he spoke, the elder's face grew dark with sorrow, realizing that what had happened in Richie's home was no accident. It was an act of vengeance calculated and executed by someone they had trusted, someone they had once celebrated. The news spread swiftly, each word falling like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples of shock and betrayal through the village. The villagers were aghast. Ciara, the brilliant, beautiful daughter of the village, the girl everyone admired, was the one behind this tragedy. The heartbreak turned to outrage, their sorrow shifting into disbelief. How could she, the pride of her family, do such a thing? What darkness had taken root in her heart to drive her to such a monstrous act? Meanwhile, Ciara remained unaware of the storm gathering around her. She was preparing to leave for university, packing her belongings in the quiet of her room, her face calm, her heart steady. She felt only a cold satisfaction, a sense of closure, believing that she was finally free to leave the village and its painful memories behind. The room around her held remnants of her past, but she no longer felt attached to any of it. She had severed her ties with this place, stepping into a new life, one where she could walk away from the person she had become. As she packed, she noticed voices outside, low and tense, growing louder with each passing moment. Curiosity stirred within her, and she went to the window, peering out to see a crowd gathering. The villagers stood solemnly, their faces hardened, their eyes narrowed. At the forefront was the elder, his face dark with disappointment, and the herbalist, wringing his hands as he looked down. And then in the crowd, her parents, her mother's face pale and stricken, her father's hand clutched to his chest, as if trying to hold back the tidal wave of grief threatening to overtake him. A moment later, there was a loud knock on her door. She opened it to find the elder standing there, flanked by the herbalist and several others, each of their faces marked by an expression she hadn't anticipated, sorrow mixed with a quiet fury. The elder's gaze was piercing, his voice grave as he spoke. "Ciara," he said, his voice thick with sorrow, "is it true? Did you seek revenge in a way that has shamed us all?" Behind him, her parents' faces contorted with the realization of her actions. Her mother covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a sob, while her father's shoulders shook, his eyes wide with disbelief. She could see the devastation etched in every line of his face, a look of betrayal so deep it seemed to reach into his very soul. Her mother wailed softly, the sound like a wounded animal, her cries filling the silence left by the elder's question. As Ciara stood before them, her mask began to slip, the weight of her actions pressing down on her with a force she hadn't anticipated. The elder continued, his voice laced with pain and anger. He recounted the herbalist's story, the powder, the tragic deaths of Richie's family. His words hung in the air, each one a judgment, each one cutting through her defenses. The villagers' murmurs rose, filled with condemnation, with horror. They had once adored Ciara, held her up as a symbol of hope and ambition, and now they saw her as a stranger, a betrayer of the values they held dear. To them, revenge had never been the answer. Forgiveness, community, and respect for life were the bedrock of their world. In choosing vengeance, Ciara had crossed the line, tearing apart the trust they had placed in her. Her father's voice broke through the silence, trembling with sorrow. Why, Ciara? We raised you to be strong, to dream, to rise above. Why did you throw it all away? Ciara met his sad gaze, the resolve that had once driven her now crumbling beneath the weight of his disappointment, his heartbreak. She could see in his eyes the memories of her childhood, the love they had poured into her, the sacrifices they had made, all shattered by her actions. Her mother, tears streaming down her face, reached out as if to touch her, but her hand fell back, too stricken by grief to complete the gesture. The police arrived, and the villagers stepped back, giving way as they took her by the arms, their expressions grim. Ciara looked at her parents one last time, the devastation in their faces etched into her memory, a reminder of the cost of her vengeance. She had wanted justice, had hungered for retribution, but in the end she had only brought ruin upon herself, upon those she loved, upon the very people who had once cherished her. As she was led through the village, her parents followed at a distance, their grief-stricken faces a silent accusation, a reminder that her actions had not only shattered Richie's family but her own as well. The elder, watching her leave, spoke a final proverb, his voice heavy with sorrow. A tree that feeds on its own roots will fall, and its branches will scatter, leaving nothing but emptiness. Ciara's story would forever be remembered as a warning, a tale of a girl consumed by love, betrayed by anger, and destroyed by her own need for revenge. And as the villagers returned to their homes, the air filled with the quiet mourning of a community that had lost not just one family but a piece of its own heart. For in the end, Ciara had paid the price for her choices, and it was a price far greater than she had ever anticipated. Ciara's capture marked the beginning of her descent into a new kind of darkness, one that was raw and unrelenting. The village's whispers had given way to a deafening silence, a condemnation so powerful that she could feel its weight in every step, every glance cast her way. Once she had walked these paths as the pride of her community, the girl who was meant to soar, the young woman whose dreams of flight had stirred admiration in the hearts of her neighbors. Now she walked that same path in chains, her reputation shattered, her family's honor lying in ruins. As she was led through the village, she could feel the eyes of the people on her, cold, distant, as if they were looking at a stranger. Mothers who had once praised her now turned away, shielding their children's eyes, as if she carried a contagious shame. Friends she had known since childhood looked at her with expressions of horror and disappointment, their admiration replaced by revulsion. Every face in the crowd seemed to carry the same message. How could you? In her heart, a numbness took hold, a sense of hollowness that gnawed at her. She had imagined justice would bring satisfaction, a sense of closure, but there was no relief in the faces of those around her, no understanding. The villagers, bound by values that prized forgiveness and community above all, could not fathom the depth of her vengeance. To them she was a warning, a story to be told in hushed voices, a reminder of the price of harboring darkness in one's heart. As they passed through the market, Ciara's parents joined the procession, trailing behind with heads lowered, faces lined with sorrow and shame. Her father, once a man proud to call her his daughter, now seemed like a man broken, a shadow of himself. He walked slowly, his shoulders hunched, unable to meet the eyes of his neighbors. Ciara could feel the intensity of their grief as if it were her own, an ache so profound that it seeped into her very bones. Her mother, who had once cherished her with every fiber of her being, looked upon her daughter as if she were seeing her for the first time, as if the girl she had raised, loved, and believed in was nothing more than a ghost. The woman's face was streaked with tears, her hands clasped tightly together in prayer, as if hoping to awaken from this nightmare. Her mother's quiet wails, soft and relentless, cut through Ciara's numbness, reaching a part of her that still remembered what it was to love, what it was to hope. The villagers watched them pass, and slowly a murmur began to rise. They remembered the days when Ciara's mother would tell them proudly of her daughter's dreams, how she was destined to become someone who made the village proud. They remembered her father's words, spoken with a smile, of how Ciara's success would lift them all, how she was the embodiment of their hope for a brighter future. Now those words seemed empty, cruel, a reminder of the depth of the family's fall from grace. Ciara was brought to the village square where the elder who had once guided her with wisdom and kindness now stood as her judge. His face was lined with sorrow, his eyes holding a sadness that seemed to reach into the very soul of the community. He spoke not with anger but with a heavy heart, recounting her actions, her deception, and the poison she had wielded. His words cut through the air, each one a hammer that drove the final nails into the coffin of her reputation. As he spoke, Ciara's crimes were laid bare before everyone. The villagers listened in horror as the elder revealed how she had feigned forgiveness, how she had wormed her way back into Richie's life only to strike with deadly intent. The tale of her deceit and the brutal end she had engineered left the crowd in stunned silence, their faces pale with shock. For her family, this was a public humiliation unlike any they had ever known. Ciara's mother wept openly, her cries mingling with the whispers of those around her. Her father's face was etched with shame, his eyes fixed on the ground as he listened to the recounting of his daughter's betrayal. Once he had been proud to stand by her side, to call her his own. Now he felt the weight of her actions pressing down on him, a burden he would carry for the rest of his days. Ciara felt their grief as if it were her own. Each sob from her mother, each look of disappointment from her father, cutting into her more deeply than any punishment the village could deliver. She realized in that moment the true cost of her actions. She had sought to heal her own pain, to right the wrong she believed had been inflicted upon her, but in the end she had only multiplied the suffering, leaving her family to bear the weight of her choices. The elder, his voice thick with emotion, spoke of the village's values, of the communal bond that had been shattered by Ciara's actions. He reminded the people that revenge, while it might satisfy for a moment, ultimately destroys both the victim and the perpetrator. His words carried a wisdom rooted in generations of tradition, a reminder that to live in harmony, they must place love and forgiveness above all else. For the villagers, Ciara's story would become a lesson, a tale passed down as a reminder of the consequences of harboring hatred in one's heart. As the elder concluded, he looked at Ciara one last time, his gaze a mixture of sorrow and pity. "We raised you with hope, Ciara," he said softly, his voice filled with a sorrow that echoed through the square. "But you have brought darkness upon yourself and upon those who loved you most. Betrayal may justify vengeance in your eyes, but in ours it is a cycle that leads only to ruin. The heart that strikes out in anger will find itself forever bound by the chains it sought to escape." The crowd murmured in agreement, their eyes fixed on Ciara with expressions of disdain and disappointment. She had become a stranger to them, an outcast, a reminder of everything they feared, a soul lost to anger, consumed by the fire of its own vengeance. Ciara was led away, her head bowed, her heart weighed down by the knowledge of what she had done. She had believed that revenge would bring her peace, that she could free herself from the chains of her past by striking back. But now, as she was taken through the village one last time, she understood that she had not found freedom. She had only created new chains, heavier and more unbreakable than before. And as her family watched her go, their faces etched with the devastation of a broken lineage, the village turned away, leaving them to bear the shame alone. Her father, who had once been proud to call her his daughter, now stood silent, his shoulders hunched beneath the weight of her actions. Her mother's sobs echoed long after she was gone, a haunting reminder of a love that had been twisted, broken, and ultimately destroyed by the very one they had cherished most. In the end, Ciara's story will be remembered not as a tale of love or ambition, but as a warning and reminder of the cost of vengeance, of the darkness that lies within when forgiveness is forsaken. Her name would become a cautionary tale, a story parents would tell their children, a lesson etched into the memory of the village. For in seeking to avenge her own betrayal, Ciara had brought ruin not only upon herself, but upon all she held dear. And as she disappeared from the village, a new emptiness settled over the community, a wound that would take generations to heal, a silence that would linger as a reminder of the consequences of a heart consumed by rage. Thus ended the tale of Ciara, the girl who had once dreamed of flying, but who had fallen, her wings burnt by the fire of her own vengeance, leaving only ashes in her wake. And so we come to the end of Ciara's story, a tale of dreams, betrayal, and the unrelenting pursuit of revenge that led to her ultimate downfall. From the hope of a bright future to the dark path she chose, Ciara's journey leaves us with questions that linger long after her footsteps have faded from the village. Now we ask you, our viewers, was Ciara's revenge justified? Could her actions be seen as a desperate response to the betrayal she endured? Or did she go too far, allowing anger to consume her heart and destroy everything she held dear? Perhaps some of you feel that the pain she suffered might justify choices she made, while others may see her actions as an irreversible tragedy, a warning of what can happen when we let our pain define us. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell us in the comments below. And if this story gripped you, if it made you question the line between justice and vengeance, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Here we bring you the most compelling African tales, stories woven from the rich fabric of our culture, each one filled with lessons, mysteries, and unforgettable characters. Don't miss out on the next story that could challenge your perspectives and bring you closer to the heart of Africa's storytelling traditions. So like, share, and subscribe, and let's continue this journey together. Thank you for joining us on this tale. Until next time, let the power of storytelling guide you and remind you of the choices we all face in the journey of life.